Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, a high-level hearing on what went wrong in the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Top leaders were on the Hill to wade through the matter. We have the highlights. Plus, a follow-up to a recent Army Times investigation of suicides among tank crews. Our reporter is here with updates on the fallout from the revelations. Also, the Air Force's first Gray Wolf makes a landing at a new base, and the Navy delays a proposed next-generation submarine. It's the latest in news and analysis from the Pentagon to the platoon, here on Defense News Weekly. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Andrea Scott. The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan was a controversial move that swiftly ended the long American war there, even as it descended into panic and carnage at the Kabul airport. The issue was once again a topic on Capitol Hill this week, where military leaders faced down members of Congress about the decisions leading up to the pullout. Military Times' Leo Shane has a report.
It's been almost 3 years since the U.S. withdrew all of its troops from Afghanistan, and that messy departure continues to be a major point of contention here on Capitol Hill. The issue came up again this week when former Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley and former CENTCOM head Kenneth McKenzie testified on Capitol Hill about what they know of the departure and their role in it. And this is the first time the two have been on Capitol Hill talking about this since they retired from the military. And as he has in the past, Milley left some of the blame at the feet of the State Department and the administration for their decision to go against his recommendation to keep some troops in the country past August 2021.
In previous public testimony, I noted that at that time, my analysis based on my assessment and the recommendations of the commanders, to include General McKenzie, and the consensus of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was that we needed to maintain a minimum force of 2,500 troops on the ground, mostly special forces, with allied troops and contractors, in order to sustain the Afghan National Security Forces and its government until the diplomatic conditions of the Doha Agreement were met. Without this support, it was my view at the time that it was only a matter of when, not if, the Afghan government would collapse and the Taliban would take control. Again, I previously publicly testified, and I consistently supported a negotiated end to the war, but only if there was a reduction in violence leading to a permanent ceasefire, and there were Afghan-to-Afghan negotiations leading to a power-sharing agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And it was my view that absent those conditions, I was not in favor of a unilateral withdrawal of U.S. forces because of my assessment of the associated costs and risks.
But the former Joint Chiefs Chairman also noted that there's not one single decision or one single mistake that led to the chaotic departure from Afghanistan. And in fact, the problems date back to multiple administrations and multiple years of military operations there.
At the peak of our military commitment in 2011, the United States had just over 100,000, or just under 100,000 troops and about 20,000 DoD contractors. That same year, the United States began to steadily draw down troops, close bases, and retrograde equipment. Nothing we're going to discuss today happened overnight. It was a process of withdrawal that spanned a decade. The outcome in Afghanistan was the cumulative effect of many decisions over many years of war. And like any complex phenomena, there's no single causal factor that determined the outcome, but multiple factors in combination. In the fall of 2020, as I previously testified publicly, my analysis, my personal analysis, was that an accelerated withdrawal would likely lead to the general collapse of the Afghan security forces and the Afghan government.
Now, this week's testimony didn't break any new major ground. Both Milley and McKenzie have testified multiple times on Capitol Hill, but it does indicate that this issue will continue to be a major topic going through the election. Republican leaders have promised as much, and House Foreign Affairs Chairman Mike McCall said that he intends to hold more hearings in the future.
People all over the world watched as babies were flung over barbed wire fence by mothers without hope. Desperate Afghans fell to their deaths from airplanes. and hordes of people surrounded the airport as they tried to flee for their lives. The damage to our reputation and our credibility, the United States credibility around the world, that damage will last for generations. Our service members were forced to watch as American citizens and Afghan allies were beaten and murdered outside the gates of the airport. These brave Americans were told to stand by as terrorists brutalized innocent civilians. And then on the morning of August 26, we watched in horror as reports of a terrorist attack at Abbey Gate flooded the news. 13 U.S. service members were murdered, with dozens more injured. 170 Afghans were killed, with countless injured as well. Some of the Abbey Gate Gold Star families members are here today, and we honor you. We honor your sacrifice here today. To the families here today and to the American people, I say, I will not rest until I get to the bottom of this tragedy.
Democrats dismissed much of the hearing as just political theater and laid a lot of the problems with the Afghanistan mission at the feet of President Donald Trump, who negotiated a withdrawal agreement with Taliban leaders back in 2020. But both Milley and Mackenzie said it was important for them to show up on Capitol Hill and answer questions on behalf of the families and the troops who sacrificed their time there. For Military Times, I'm Leo Shane.
Thanks, Leo. Next up, while the military as a whole has long struggled with the issue of suicide among service members, a lot of the details of who is most at risk can be hard to figure out. Army Times reporter Davis Winke recently obtained a slew of data that revealed a surprising finding: that one type of job in the Army was up to 3 times more at risk of suicide than any other. The most at risk? Tankers, the crews and maintainers who work on America's heaviest pieces of battlefield armor. With more on the fallout from the reporting, we talked with Davis about what's happened since he published his report. Thank you for joining us, Davis. You recently completed a big investigation into suicides in the Army, and you found that those in tanker units were at an especially high risk. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, to recap the broken track investigation, we took 3 years of Army non-combat death data and found that holders of the 19-kilo occupational specialty, or enlisted tank crew members, were nearly 3 times as likely as other active duty soldiers to die by suicide. Zooming out a little bit, we found that members of Armored Brigade combat teams were more than twice as likely to kill themselves as other soldiers. At that point, we started talking to experts in the Army's tank community and to mental health experts as well. They told us that a new line of suicide prevention research holds that people who have a lot of stress and difficulty in their daily lives are at a greater risk of suicide if they suffer an acute stressor after that. And what they told us was that members of the armor community who had been experiencing a really high deployment rate and a lot of overwork over the past decade certainly fit the bill and likely face a higher systemic suicide risk than other members of the Army.
So what has the response been from Congress?
We've heard back from a number of lawmakers regarding our work. One of them, Representative Don Bacon, he's a Republican representative from Nebraska. He's the head of the House Armed Services Committee's Quality of Life subpanel. Bacon told us that it's time for the Army to begin reassessing whether it needs to have a tank brigade permanently living in Europe. The reason for that is one of the big sources of strain for the Army's tank community has been the need to fill a constant quota of overseas deployments for these tank brigades. They've been rotating there on the one after the other basis for almost a decade now, and the demand only increased in the wake of the Ukraine war. We also heard from Representative Chrissy Houlihan. She's a Democrat from Pennsylvania, also a member of the House Armed Services Committee. She and Senator Angus King, an independent from Maine, told us that the Pentagon needs to get it together and submit overdue suicide data that they were supposed to have to Congress back in December. Those numbers were supposed to include suicides broken out by career field, dating all the way back to 2001. The two lawmakers were pretty clear that the data is intended to inform legislation that can help save lives among service members, because military suicide has been something that the Defense Department can't quite shake.
What is the Pentagon saying about this? Have you heard back from them?
So we spoke with the Office of the Secretary of Defense about the deployment rates for certain units. The way it currently works is that for a unit to go overseas after not meeting a minimum amount of time at home requires a waiver either from the Defense Secretary or at a certain level from their respective service secretary. We asked for data about those waivers to try to see if there were other communities that are being impacted by high operational tempo and deployments, and the Pentagon said that's classified. We're going to keep digging into that to see if we can bring out more info. The Army also got in touch with me and talked to me some about measures they're taking to try to make life better for their armor units. One of them is an effort at Fort Cavazos, Texas, for example, to reduce maintenance stress on soldiers by better educating battalion executive officers on how to run maintenance programs. Long nights in the motor pool, turning wrenches on tanks and Bradleys, are some of the biggest stressors that these guys constantly face. But at a more programmatic level, the Army told me recently that they're actually looking to change the way that they prepare tank units for deployment. Instead of having 16 months to do their modernization and then their training, they want to take that period and extend it to 24 months with a full year for modernization and a full year for training. Army officials told me that they hope that means tank units will be able to have a more sustainable pace of prep for their 8-month deployment, and that will allow for full maintenance cycles in between training events. That should therefore defray some of those extra hours in the motor pool that really drive up stress.
For those of us following this story, what can we be watching for in those weeks ahead?
I would keep an eye out for more reporting from us on the way that the Army manages its pre-deployment cycles and on other units that may be undergoing similar strains. The problem of operational tempo is one that really gets at the core of quality of life programs impacting service members right now. Some viewers may think back to the surges during the global war on terror and say, well, hey, I deployed pretty rapidly during that period. But service members who did that were well compensated. When you're in a combat zone, you don't pay taxes and you have other additional allowances based on that. But the service members who've been doing these non-combat deployments, say to Europe, to Korea, to the Middle East in the post-GWOT world, they don't have those same financial incentives, but they have to spend the same amount of time away from their families and away from their homes.
Well, thank you for joining us today and talking about this very important reporting that you've done.
Thanks for having me.
Don't go away. When we come back, a World War II veteran gets knighted by the French government. Don't miss it. World War II was a time of many unsung heroes, but one veteran from the Great War recently got his due. Earlier in March, 99-year-old Samuel Meyer, best known in his home city of New Orleans as the purveyor of a hat store, was granted a knighthood by the French government at the National World War II Museum. Drafted at the age of 18, Meyer was an Air Force corporal who loaded bombs and ammunition onto P-38 fighter planes, serving in France, Belgium, Britain, and Germany. Meyer, who still works part-time at the hat store his grandfather started in 1894, said he was excited to receive the award.
I'm enjoying all the hoopla today and the wonderful work that people have done to get this award to me, give that to me. I'm just very thrilled about it. It brings back the old days.
What he did, for what he represents as a symbol of that bond between France and the United States, and something we cherish, and I think it's even more important to think about their sacrifice, what they have been doing for us, and what kind of world we want to have for our children and grandchildren.
Many of you know, following the war, Sam returned home to New Orleans and continued his service in his family business. Many of you may be familiar with the cherished New Orleans institution, Meyer the Hatter. And if you're not, you should become familiar with this cherished institution.
I work 3 days a week. I don't have to, but I just do it. And that's all I live for, really. And my family, of course, everybody.
Meyer was awarded the rank of Chevalier, or Knight, in France's National Order of the Legion of Honor.
Merci beaucoup.
Up next, SHOT Show in Las Vegas is an exhibition of all kinds of firearms and gear that are of interest to the military and veterans communities. While there this year, we got a look at a particularly interesting new capability. If you haven't heard of a binary trigger, you're not alone. But what if you could fire 2 rounds with 1 trigger pull? Our team was on the ground to see how it works.
You know single shot, you know full auto. Some of you have shot 3-round bursts, but have you heard of binary? That's what Franklin Armory has at SHOT Show this year that is shipping out just this year itself. I've got Dan here. What is a binary trigger?
Franklin Armory's patented binary trigger system is a semi-automatic trigger, classified by ATF, that allows you to fire on pull, but also fire on release. So it's 1 function, pull, fire, 1 fire, release, 1 function of fire.
And what kind of applications do we have here? I see somebody doing some really fast target shooting behind us.
Absolutely. So binary trigger system was developed for 3 main purposes. Recreation, 1, it's just a lot of fun. 2, sporting, right? A lot of competition shooters need 2 rapid, successful shots. That application also carries over into self-defense, as a lot of trainers will teach that kind of double tap mentality.
As soon as someone from the government looks at it, they might have other ideas for, a federal law enforcement agency or military. Is that something that could be coming up in the future? Is different applications?
We talked to law enforcement. A couple of different departments have inquired because they're looking for a solution that is more, if you will, flexible, that you can actually control going back and forth for the selection. You're not just stuck in one mode, and it's not something that in that mode you're stuck in. It has to be, say, full auto. You don't have that choice of doing a 3-round burst or a 2-round burst. But with this, again, you can control, even in binary mode, you can choose what rate your 2 rounds will actually come out. You can either hold that trigger until you're ready to release it on another target, or you can very quickly put 2 in 1 target.
All right, let's talk hardware. What exactly are we selling? Because I see this is a Glock 17 body right here.
Correct. So our G-Series model, the first one we brought to SHOT Show last year, prototyped it. People loved it. We started shipping it this year. Was for the GS173. That's for the Glock 17, 3rd generation. So it's a 9mm, right? This is Grand Power Strybog's very popular PCC. It works in both the A1 and A3 models, as well as the A3G that takes the Glock magazines. Same functionality as we talked before. 3 positions, right? Safe, position 1. Semi-automatic, traditional, position 2. And then binary mode in position 3.
What are people liking about it? What are people kind of wanting from it? And what are you seeing on the demand side?
Once you kind of realize the application of it, that's where you get what people start talking about, right? Like, hey, yeah, I can really either run the trigger very well, I've gotten that musical kind of cadence down, or I enjoy the concept of being able to have a very quick, repetitive double tap split time.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah, thank you.
When we return, our personal finance expert is back with advice on avoiding the danger of buy now, pay later purchasing. Welcome back. On this edition of Money Minute, personal finance expert Jeanette Mack brings you advice on avoiding the dangers of buy now, pay later offerings for big purchases.
According to stats published by Yaguara.co, 81% of Americans are shopping online. It's become an everyday thing for most of us. And with the rise of e-commerce, the popularity of buy now, pay later at checkout is rising as well. Buy now, pay later, or BNPL for short, is basically a short-term installment loan, which for many can be a great way to buy the things you need without fees or high interest rates. But BNPL can also lead to problems if you can't make the payments. To stay safe, never borrow more than you can afford. Know your number and don't go overboard. Regularly review your balance and don't stack your loans. Pay off one balance before adding another. If the merchant offers auto pay, use it. This will help you pay it off on time. Try not to use buy now, pay later for impulse purchases. This can lead to repeated bad habits. Try to use your debit card for purchases on and offline to help keep your spending under control. And set the rule for yourself not to use BNPL for things you want and only for things you actually need. Ultimately, loans of any kind should be taken out on a need-only basis. Shopping and spending is a part of everyday life. Just make sure you're shopping safely and spending wisely.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more coverage of military and defense topics, take a break from those push-ups and check out militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more headlines. And to be the smartest Marine in the amphib, sign up for our early bird brief, compiled each morning to bring you the most up-to-date headlines. And if social media is where you collect your open source intelligence, follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X. And like most junior service members, we're on TikTok, so go find us there as well. Stick around, there's more Defense News Weekly after the break. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Andrea Scott. The U.S. Navy is pushing back the start of construction of its next-generation attack nuclear submarine by nearly a decade. Now scheduled to start construction in the early 2040s, the Navy cited tight budgets and the need to fund current and near-term operations as a reason for the delay. The program is designed to outpace the advancement of U.S. near-peer adversaries and keep dominance in underwater combat. And the Air Force's newest helicopter has reported for duty. The first field-ready MH-139 Gray Wolf helicopter arrived at Montana's Malmstrom Air Force Base earlier in March, marking the operation's start for a new fleet designed to protect U.S. land-based nuclear missiles. The Gray Wolf will be used to patrol intercontinental ballistic missile fields at air bases out west and replaces the UH-1N Hueys that entered the service in 1970. And that's all we have time for in this episode. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.